How do you measure developer productivity? How do you even define productivity? Despite incredible advances in our industry, these two simple questions still elude us as researchers, developers, and leaders. But we need to measure productivity. If we can't measure productivity, we don't know how well we're doing. We don't know if we're getting better or getting worse. And like many of you, if your full-time job is productivity, you have no way of showing whether anything you're doing is impacting the business or moving the needle. I came face to face with this challenge a few years ago while I was working at GitHub. At GitHub, we'd recently been acquired by Microsoft, and leaders felt like we were shipping kind of slow. They wanted us to ship faster, and they wanted us to be able to measure it. So here we were again, asking the question, what should we measure? And the task of answering that question fell on me. This wasn't my first at-bat at this. I had opinions, but I was new at GitHub and wanted to reach a consensus solution, so I decided to organize a meeting. I brought together our CEO, Nat, and all the VPs and heads of engineering into a room and posed a question to them. What does productivity mean to you, and how would you suppose that we measure it? There was an awkward pause and silence that fell in the room. No one said anything. Then after a little while, someone said, at my last company, we measured the number of pull requests per engineer. Someone else said, I think productivity should be measured in terms of business value delivered. Someone else said, why don't we just measure the DORA metrics? Eventually, our CEO, Nat, stepped in. He said, to me, productivity is, I think of it like GDP, yield per engineer, profit per engineer. And I thought to myself, that seems a little bit weird. Seems a little bit agricultural. I mean, we're producing software here, not farms. But I'd heard so many ideas that day that every idea seemed fair to consider. And that night, I got back home and I couldn't get this problem out of my mind. There's so many suggestions. Which one was right? And to try to settle my mind, I went on Google and searched the definition of productivity. And funny enough, the definition that came up was the state or quality of producing something, especially crops. And so it turned out that maybe productivity does have its roots in agriculture, and maybe that was right. This, of course, didn't help me. I was lost. Was it farms? Was it pull requests, DORA metrics, something else? And a lot of you in this room have probably been in a similar situation. It's really frustrating and really difficult to try to even come to a definition of productivity, nonetheless try to measure it. And the thing is that this is just the way things are, at least for now, because productivity can't be defined in simple terms, and it can't be broken down into simple numbers. The SPACE framework, written by my colleagues Dr. Nicole Forsgren and Margaret Ann Story and others, outlines how productivity is multidimensional, and it can't be boiled down to a single definition or single set of measures. And in the SPACE framework, they provide this big, huge table of suggested metrics across 5 different dimensions, 3 different levels. And I was talking to a leader recently who said to me that I had hoped that the SPACE framework was going to give me a clear set of answers on what to measure. But instead, it just left him feeling more confused. And while I understand this leader's sentiment, this is kind of the point of SPACE. It's show us that this isn't a simple problem, and there isn't a simple set of answers. Which leads me back to my story at GitHub. So we hadn't been able to come to an agreement on what productivity was or how we should be measuring it, but we'd already begun working on some productivity improvements, and so we needed something to measure. Now, at the time, as they still are today, the DORA metrics were kind of the Kool-Aid. Everyone was talking about the DORA metrics, including one of our senior VPs. So he made the decision top-down that the DORA metrics were what we were going to measure, which concerned me because as a leadership team, we were very far apart on what productivity was, and I don't think we even understood really what our goals were for our metrics. I remember in one meeting, this VP saying, the DORA metrics are the gold standard. And I remember thinking, gold standard? Gold standard of what? We couldn't even state what our goal was. Were these metrics appropriate? Would they be useful? These were questions we weren't asking. We then spent the next couple of quarters building out a DORA dashboard. This took a lot of time, money, and energy because our data was dispersed across a whole bunch of different systems at GitHub and Microsoft. So engineers had to figure out how to instrument and extract the data, load it into this data warehouse that was connected to Looker. And all this costs millions of dollars, which isn't unusual. If you work at a large company and you've worked on something like this, you know that it can take months, even years, to just get the data in one place to be able to start doing some reporting. And then you get to figure out tough challenges around what is it we're even calculating. Is it time for something like lead time, time from first commit to deploy or merge to deploy? What even is a deploy? Those are questions we were dealing with. At GitHub, we kind of skipped over some of these tough questions, and soon enough, we had our DORA dashboard. So this is what it looked like, at least a cartoon version. And I remember the first time I looked at this, felt really powerful. We had all this data, things were going to be great. But then, slowly, it became clear that there were a lot of things that we were going to have to figure out. I mean, look at this dashboard for a second, and like, what is it telling you? What is it saying to you? Are we doing good? Do we need to improve? What should we do? At GitHub, these were some of the questions that came up after we got the DORA metrics. And again, the task of answering these fell on me. And over the course of the next few months, as I worked across the business to figure out answers, eventually I came to a really sobering conclusion that the DORA metrics weren't really telling us anything. I'll get more into the reasons behind this in a few minutes, but at the time, this is a really difficult fact to swallow. We just spent millions of dollars building this DORA dashboard, and it was supposed to be our messiah, our North Star that was going to guide us, except it didn't. And the thing is, I've come to learn that my experience and our experience with the DORA metrics, unfortunately, isn't all that unique. I talk to leaders every week, especially developer productivity leaders who've gone through similar experiences. They've pinned their hopes on the DORA metrics, spent a whole bunch of time and effort building out dashboards, only to later realize that they aren't giving us the insights we'd hoped for. So there are two important takeaways here. The first is that the DORA metrics have gotten a little bit out of control. I think we'd all agree. And there's a lot of people, especially vendors, selling DORA metric tools or related tools that are really hyping these things up, and it's organizations and leaders like us that are paying the price. The second lesson is that just in general, we can't copy and paste metrics from a book or some article, like a McKinsey article, and expect that things are going to go well, right? Developer productivity is too complex to just copy and paste the solution. And I want to be clear, this problem isn't just the DORA metrics. It's PR metrics, cycle time, the space framework metrics. There's all these metrics that we are just assuming are the ones we should use. And as this slide shows, even the authors of these frameworks and this research are warning us about their regret about how their work is getting misused. So now I want to get into why the DORA metrics didn't work for us and why it is that we're struggling so much with measuring productivity. And to start, I want to look at how it is that we're actually measuring productivity today. So this is a list of common metrics. If you're in this room, you probably measure some of these things or have thought about measuring them. We have DORA metrics like lead time, change failure rates, all kinds of cycle times. We have story points, even though we know we are supposed to be measuring that, but a lot of us do anyways. And stay with me here for a moment because I want to talk about something else, and we'll come back to this in a minute. What I want to talk about is manufacturing, cars, assembly lines, factories. And the reason I want to talk about manufacturing is that if I were to ask people in this room, how are software development and manufacturing related? I bet that most of you would say that they're not that related at all. But what I've realized is that when we look closer, actually, the way we're thinking about and approaching software development and manufacturing are more similar than we think. So one example of this is just the way we think about the SDLC. We often decompose it into a sequential series of steps and figure out how we can break down, optimize, and measure each one. An example of this would be something like the Scaled Agile Framework, which goes by SAFe, which kind of literally turns your software organization into a factory. I've heard leaders refer to their organizations as a software factories, which is problematic, but we won't get into that for now. Another practice that we've literally borrowed from manufacturing is lean software development. Lean is a production method originating from the 60s from Toyota. So it's kind of weird we're in the age of LLMs and AI, but still talking about software in terms that were invented before the internet existed. Now you might be thinking, all right, we've borrowed a couple of ideas and terms, but we don't think of our organizations as software factories. So what's the problem? It's this next point that I think has really gotten us into trouble. So here are those metrics of ours again on the left. And now on the right is another list of metrics, except these metrics don't come from software teams. These come from the Manufacturing Enterprise Solutions Association metrics working group. But look closely at these two lists of metrics. The left and right look pretty similar. Sort of looks like we've borrowed our metrics from manufacturing. I mean, we have lead times, cycle times, throughput, yield. And so the problem I'm trying to illustrate here is that we're actually oftentimes measuring software development like we do manufacturing, and that simply doesn't work. Peter Drucker, who I'm sure many of us here have quoted for his line, "You can't manage what you don't measure," also wrote a paper in 1999 titled "Knowledge Worker Productivity, Our Biggest Challenge." And in it, he describes why knowledge worker productivity is fundamentally different than manual work. And the core point is this. Picture someone working on an assembly line of a factory. They perform the same task over and over again repetitively. And this means that we can measure how many tasks they complete and how long it takes them to complete it, and the higher the number, the better. But in contrast, in software development, every task is kind of different. Some tasks are small, some are being complex. Sometimes our task is to sit in a chair, think, and just come up with the next set of tasks that we need to work on. And so if we measure the number of tasks completed or how long it takes to complete a task, it doesn't tell us a whole lot other than that the tasks were probably pretty easy or small. Now I want to take you back to the story at GitHub to tell you why the DORA metrics didn't work for us. So after we had created this DORA dashboard, my boss was really excited about it. So he came to me with another idea, which was that I would take on an OKR to increase GitHub's engineering velocity by 20%. I was skeptical about this because I wasn't really bought into even the concept of the DORA metrics at the time. But I thought, well, this will be a good experience in actually using metrics to improve productivity, which is supposed to be the whole point. So to improve lead time by 20%, my strategy was going to be find the teams that were doing the worst, make them better, and then hopefully that would lift up the lead time for all of GitHub. So I got a list of teams with the highest lead time, and I went to them, and I said, what's going on? Why is your lead time so slow? And it turned out that all of them had nothing wrong at all. They would tell me things were perfectly fine. One team, for example, actually just wasn't using a standard PR workflow, so their metrics are skewed. There was another team that was batching their releases intentionally, because that's what was best for the customer, so their stats looked bad, but it was the right thing to do. What I realized from all this was that these metrics were misleading me. They weren't telling me the full story, because they were missing context needed to fully understand them. And the greater lesson here is that all of these types of metrics give us only really a thin slice of the picture. I mean, if we're counting tickets or deployments, we know that these things aren't created equal. And we also know that there's so much work that developers do outside of tickets and pull requests and deployments that our metrics aren't able to capture. But this wasn't the only problem I ran into with the metrics. A few weeks after this, my boss came back to me and said, hey, so what do we need to do to actually improve? And I laughed at him because at this point, I didn't even know what teams needed to improve. Funny enough, around the same time, some other leaders had launched this big initiative around accelerating our build times. I want to caveat this story by saying improving build times is important. We are at a Gradle conference. But there's a disconnect at GitHub. Because when I went and talked to the teams and asked them, I would say, hey, we're trying to improve lead time. What's the thing that's holding you back? They would tell me things like, our product management process is broken and there's so much churn in the work we're doing, or we're having a lot of trouble coordinating with this other team. But build times actually never came up. So the lesson here is that although metrics tell us what's happening, they don't tell us what we need to do to actually improve. They don't tell us where to focus. And this is a huge problem, given that a big part of the reason we use these metrics is to hopefully guide us to figure out where to improve. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to be up here just bashing metrics or advocating that we don't use these metrics. There's definitely really good use cases for all the metrics that I've talked about today. But there are some serious gaps and flaws, as we've talked about. And the question is, what can we do instead? What can we do to fill those gaps? So to lead into that, I want to tell you another story. Earlier in my career, before I was at GitHub, I built a company called PullPanda. And PullPanda focused on pulling data out of GitHub to provide mostly pull request metrics to teams. By a lot of accounts, PullPanda was a success. We had over 1,000 organizations using it. We were eventually acquired by GitHub. But I never felt fully satisfied. And the reason for this was that, you see, with PullPanda, I had this big vision that the goal of the company was to measure and help organizations transform productivity. And when companies would find the product, that's what they thought too. Their leaders would say, oh yeah, we're going to use these metrics to improve productivity. But then when I would actually talk to teams that were using this tool and ask them, so what are you using the metrics for? Their use cases felt really small and insignificant compared to the vision. At one point, I felt like there wasn't anything else I could come up with. I'd come up with every Git metric that you possibly could. And to make sure I was being fully exhaustive, I created a simple table. So on the left, I listed each metric. This is a truncated version of it. And on the right, I listed what it was that people were actually trying to do with this metric. So I was going through this table one by one, taking inventory of every metric I'd ever thought of that could come out of Git, until I got to this circled row, number of comments per review. This was something a bunch of my customers had asked for because they had been using the metrics we had to make code reviews go faster, and now they were worried that the code reviews were getting worse because people were just rubber stamping. The thing about this metric, though, was that I really didn't like it. It felt like a stretch. It just didn't feel like the number of comments in a review, if you use GitHub, you can kind of picture that. I didn't feel like that was really a good signal of review quality. And as I was thinking about this problem and getting pretty frustrated, I really did not want to build this feature. An idea hit me. What if, instead of trying to produce some kind of fancy metric out of Git, what if we just ask developers instead? Meaning, what if instead of proxying for review quality, we instead just asked developers to rate how good they thought their code reviews were and measured that? And what if we did this not just for code review quality, but for all the metrics that were in that list? For example, instead of PR cycle time, we could just ask developers to rate whether they work on small iterative changes. Or instead of measuring time to first review, we could just ask the developers how long it takes them or if they get code reviews on a timely basis. Today, this is kind of a revelation at the time and felt like a crazy idea. Today, I believe that for almost every productivity question we have, the best signal we can get is by asking our developers. And this is still kind of a crazy idea. Some of you might think I'm wacko. But what solidified my conviction in this was over the years realizing that all the smartest companies and researchers were already doing this for years, unbeknownst to most of us. One place where you see qualitative metrics being used is in research. This is just a recent example where GitHub published a study on the productivity impact of Copilot. And you'd assume that they would tie Copilot to the number of pull requests produced or commit frequency, something like that, but they didn't. They focus on how developers felt and what developers experienced. Another example is actually Dora. And I want to clarify, I talked about a challenging experience with Dora metrics, but I'm a huge fan of the research. And something that a lot of people don't know about Dora is that the Dora metrics in the book and in the ongoing research are captured using surveys. And actually in the book Accelerate, there's an entire chapter devoted to promoting the use of surveys for measuring software delivery. What's most notable, though, is that over the past few years, I've learned that all the top companies are investing in qualitative metrics heavily through the use of developer survey programs. And if you talk to the leaders or the people behind these programs, they'll tell you that this is the primary means through which they understand productivity. So the question is why? Why are top companies doing this? Why are qualitative metrics powerful? One answer is that qualitative metrics are actually the only way to measure something that is intangible. When you think about developer productivity, it's definitely not lines of code. It's not commits. It's not deployments. It's not cycle time. It's kind of a thing in our imagination and in our minds. It's a quality. And all quality problems must be assessed through human judgment. Now we're entering into the field of psychometrics, which is the field devoted to measurement of human preferences and attitudes. And it's a deep field. So there's a couple of analogies or ideas that I'd like to share that I like to think about. So one analogy I like is that when we think about objective metrics, hard metrics, we think about how we're getting the data, right? We use telemetry to capture input and then turn that into output, which are our metrics. So one analogy I like is that with psychometrics, we're simply using humans, the human mind, as our measurement instrument, just like you would use a thermometer to measure the temperature. Or here's another way of thinking about qualitative metrics that I like. I think one of the reasons we like objective metrics is because it feels so precise. It feels like it's a program, it's an algorithm that we control. But with a little bit of greater knowledge, I think we can begin to think of qualitative metrics in the same way. And there's a really great model from the book, The Psychology of a Survey Response, that I think outlines this. They break down the actual cognitive process of responding to a survey question into these 4 steps. And when you look at these steps, almost seems like we're talking about a computer program. Comprehension, data retrieval, response. And so, my hope is that when we look at something like this, we can begin to see the human mind not as something that's going to give us subjective, useless opinions, but rather a powerful measurement instrument that we can leverage. So we've talked about how qualitative metrics are powerful, are powerful, and how all the top companies are doing it. But the real reason I'm here giving this talk is because this is a really underutilized method. And in my experience, and the experience of other folks who've done this sort of thing, a big challenge and reason why this is underutilized is that people have a lot of skepticism and I would say prejudice against surveys. But this prejudice, I believe, is rooted in a misunderstanding and misconceptions, two of which I want to talk about here briefly. So the most common objection, complaint, or rejection I hear about qualitative metrics is that survey data is just a bunch of subjective junk. I hear that all the time. And I think this is a fair attitude for people to have, especially given our typical experiences with workplace surveys and polls online. But the reality is that surveys not only can be reliable, but they can measure objective information as well. There's actually two types of survey questions. One is attitudinal, which measures people's feelings and opinions towards things. But then there's behavioral questions, which measure facts and events, objective information. A really good example of this is actually, again, Dora, who uses a survey question to measure lead time. And you can see, if you think back to our GitHub example, why using a survey question could have maybe saved us millions of dollars of all that instrumentation to build the dashboard. The other common opposition to surveys that I hear is that they're just fundamentally unreliable, that people are too biased in how they respond to people lie. My justful response to this is always that if you're paying people, I don't know, $200,000 a year and can't trust them to tell you about their experience with their tools and their processes, then you have bigger problems than metrics. But in more seriousness, survey data can be unreliable. It's true. But well-designed surveys done well, science shows, are incredibly reliable. And of course, designing reliable surveys is really hard to do. There's fields devoted to this. You need experts. But it's something that I think all of us can learn a little bit about. And this is my personal favorite book that I recommend. The earlier part of my talk was really kind of negative toward quantitative metrics. And so I want to kind of peel that back now. Quantitative metrics have their flaws, but the truth is qualitative metrics do too. And we talked about how productivity is this really complex and perplexing problem. And so it's really by using both quantitative and qualitative metrics in combination that we have even a chance at beginning to understand it. And this is exactly what the top companies do. They use qualitative metrics to get the broad picture of productivity and then augment it with quantitative metrics where it's needed and doable. So if you're already doing this, I encourage you to double down. If you're not doing qualitative metrics, I'd invite you to give it a chance. If you want to learn more about how to do it, this is a paper I recently published that goes into it. Thank you for your time today.